channel. It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with a writing video. Today we are discussing more mystery tropes. We're gonna keep going with this little series because it's fun. Previous videos we have discussed how to plot twists like Agatha Christie. We've discussed the mystery genre as a whole. We've talked about Nancy Drew, our queen of cozy mysteries. And now we're going to be talking about these mystery tropes from Sherlock Holmes, because I am Sherlocked by these tropes. I'm sorry, please don't unsubscribe. So, if you don't know who Sherlock Holmes is, I will give you the little Wikipedia summary of who he is. Sherlock Holmes is a fictional private detective created by British author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He refers to himself as a consulting detective in his stories, and Holmes is known for his proficiency with observation, deduction, forensic science, and logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic, which he employs when investigating cases for a wide variety of clients, including Scotland Yard. Sherlock Holmes, even though it was written in the mid to late 19th century, is still popular today. So on my bookshelf that I just took out, I actually have an illustrated pop-up book edition of Scandal in Bohemia and the Blue Carbuncle, which is really cool. I found it at Barnes & Noble of all places. So like that's really cool. And ta-da! So this is probably one of the like nerdiest things I have. Yeah, like when else am I gonna find a pop-up book of Sherlock Holmes? So I was like, I had to buy it. The Royal Society of Chemistry also has an honorary fellowship on Holmes for his use of forensic science and analytical chemistry in popular literature. Like there are several statues of Sherlock Holmes around the world. There's also several societies like the Sherlock Holmes Society in London, the Baker Street Irregulars. There's a lot. It's crazy. And of course, there's all the different adaptations. But we're not here to give you a history lesson on Sherlock Holmes. No. I'm here to talk to you about the common mystery tropes in Sherlock Holmes stories, because when we were discussing the different types of mysteries, I mentioned this specifically because I mentioned Sherlock Holmes as the original like hard detective as opposed to cozy mystery. So these are a lot of the different tropes that come up in the hardened detective, detective stories as opposed to cozy mysteries, because generally cozy mysteries deal with an amateur sleuth or a private investigator, whereas a detective story or a not cozy mystery deals with a detective generally, or a private investigator generally. Not always the case, obviously, but most of the time they deal with a detective or somebody who unofficially takes on the role of a detective. Here are these mystery tropes from Sherlock Holmes and other detectives popular within the detective mystery genre. The "who murdered this a-hole" trope. Someone has been murdered, and the detectives are on the scene. The first step, of course, is to simply determine what sort of motivation someone might have had to kill them. There's just one problem. Everyone had a motivation to kill this person. So remember when we talked about unlikable characters and how there are some stories where you do need them? There are so many examples of this type of trope all over the place. It's honestly really funny to read. It's fun to read, and it's kind of fun to write. It's easy to build sympathy for the victim when the victim's somebody who is beloved, but then it also makes it really obvious who the potential suspects are. This trope, you throw any type of sympathy for the victim out the window. The more you ask questions, the more you stop sympathizing with the victim, and the more you kind of understand why the killer did it. Agatha Christie specifically loved this one as well. You know, we gotta give shout outs to my girl Agatha Christie. And so did Arthur Conan Doyle. Sherlock Holmes exaggerated in the adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton, where the titular Milverton was such a terrible person that Holmes not only flat out refuses to investigate his murder, but he had personally witnessed it and chose not to intervene. This trope is used in Murder on the Orient Express, although this video isn't about Agatha Christie, but you are going to hear her come up a lot because she does use a lot of these tropes, just like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did, because these are just very common tropes in the detective genre. I like this trope because it's really funny in like an ironic way that you have no sympathy for the victim, and the more you learn about the victim of the crime, the less the detective really wants to solve the case, and also the more difficult it is to solve the case because you can't just figure out who did it. You can't just figure out who had the motivation and then like go from there. You have to really look into the forensics of it and look into witnesses, and like it forces the detective to do detective work as opposed to just kind of going off of, oh, this person's suspicious, so now I can build my case around them. Another trope is the Sherlock Scan. Wonder where that one came from. So this is when a detective comes to a conclusion about someone they just met just by looking at them. I think the show Sherlock does the best visual representation of this, where Sherlock looks at them and then you have the little sketches of like, oh, this person wears glasses, but they're only blue light glasses. Or, oh, this person puts their hair up, that's because they want to look nice today. Or they wear a flannel because they wanted to look comfortable. Or maybe they're a lumberjack, and like making deductions about the person from there. So that is the Sherlock Scan, where you just kind of figure everything out about a person just from looking at them. This one's very common with anybody who's trying to imitate Sherlock Holmes. However, it's very important you balance out the character who does the Sherlock Scan, because otherwise they can come across as a Mary Sue. Ripped from the headlines. A crime story based on a real crime. A lot of Doyle's works were actually taken from real things that happened around the world, like current events, and he weaves them into the story. Usually he does this where you go through the whole solving the case and everything, and then at the end, or when the criminal like explains everything that happened to Sherlock, or Sherlock like finds out the backstory, that's when you find out why the crime was committed. That's when you find out the headline it was ripped from. Like there's some stories about Mormons in the state of Utah from the 19th century that was weaved into a Sherlock Holmes story that took place in London. This is very common in a lot of mysteries and extremely common in Sherlock Holmes. It actually made more people aware of what was going on in the world, because then they would read that and be like, is that true? And then find out, yes it is. Another trope is hide the evidence. Hiding the evidence of something wrong or embarrassing is a major plot point. So that also happens in the story that I mentioned earlier in the Who Murdered This A-Hole, where Sherlock Holmes and Watson were actually burglarizing Milverton's house, destroy incriminating documents, and that's when they witness this guy's murder, and Sherlock chooses not to intervene. I haven't read that story, but I found it in my search and in my research about these different tropes. So when I read it, if I have to make corrections, I will. But a lot of times in detective stories, I mean, you have a lot of the search is finding the evidence, especially if you have a very cunning criminal. The search is finding the very incriminating evidence. Hidden in plain sight. Something is being searched for, and it turns out it was there the whole time, blended into the surroundings. Subtropes of this type include needle in a stack of needles, where it just blends in so well, like how are you gonna find it? And wax museum morgue, and lost in a crowd. So a lot of times in Sherlock Holmes, if it's hidden in plain sight, a lot of times everyone else will miss it. They will fail the spot check, but Sherlock Holmes won't necessarily miss it. And actually, one counter to that comes up in the story with Irene Adler in A Scandal in Bohemia. In the original story, he fakes an injury just outside her house to get a risque photo after being asked by I think it's a prince or a count or something who's about to get married. Obviously, doesn't want this risque photo to get out. Because one, he's very high up in royal status, and two, he's about to get married. So Sherlock Holmes fakes an injury to get into Irene's house, and then has Watson set a fire because he knows that wherever she put the safe is going to be hidden in plain sight, right? So he sets the fire because he knows that when there's an emergency, her eyes will flit to wherever her valuables have been stored, and it goes to like a painting or like wherever the safe has been hidden in plain sight. An interesting little factoid of how Sherlock Holmes counteracted the evidence is hidden in plain sight trope. So that's one of the fun things about Sherlock Holmes, is how he takes a lot of these tropes and it kind of counters them. A lot of these tropes about how criminals try to outsmart the detectives, and then he outsmarts them trying to outsmart. Yeah. Another trope is the game never stops. The character takes part in a game involving a simulated death, and then somebody actually dies, or so it seems. Turns out, the game hasn't ended yet. Of course, this comes up in Sherlock Holmes, especially in Sherlock, the TV show. finger-licking poison. Someone was poisoned by licking something that was covered in poison. A lot of times people overlook that. Hidden in plain sight, a lot of these tropes tend to overlap. The vehicle for the poison that was licked or eaten is hidden in plain sight, but because of Sherlock's ideology of whatever is left, however impossible, must be the answer. As I said before, he did all of these different experiments at his house, knows all of this random forensics knowledge off of the top of his head, so Sherlock is often able to kind of test if a powder or liquid is drugs by like sniffing it or tasting it. Again, this is very common in the movie and TV show adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, and I think the plays sometimes as well. Exposition victim. So remember what I was talking about that it's ripped from the headlines? A lot of times the exposition victim is the one who revealed how it was ripped from the headlines. So this is when, upon finding out who the killer is, the character speaks to them instead of fighting or running away. This is very common in these short stories. Eagle-eye detection, of course, that's a detective whose main skill is being really observant. A lot of times, what can be disappointing about some adaptations of Sherlock is that's all he is. They just have him be really observant and that's it, which is a reduction of his skills. A lot of times if you have a different character who's making fun of Sherlock Holmes, that's all they ever do. They're just like, elementary, my dear Watson, because I smelled toothpaste on your breath, which means you brushed your teeth this morning, you didn't eat breakfast, or something like that. And that's all they have going for them when they're trying to be an amateur sleuth. And we have beneath notice, disguising oneself in very plain or regular person. Good night, Mr. Holmes. This is something that Sherlock Holmes does a lot. He frequently just relies on going out in disguise to do recon a lot of times in the story. However, the one time it comes up, like I said before, is in the story with Irene Adler in A Scandal in Bohemia. Irene Adler, spoiler alert, I guess, it's a short story, so it's a pretty quick read. But Irene Adler catches Sherlock, she knows that he took the picture, and she's able to disguise herself because she's an actress, so naturally she knows how to disguise herself and whatnot. She disguises herself as, I think like a young boy or something like that, and follows him home with Watson, pickpockets him, gets the picture back, and then leaves. And all she says is, "Good night, Mr. Holmes," and he has no idea what happened until later that day where he realizes that he doesn't have the picture anymore. So then they have to go back to her house. She's already gone, and in the safe in the picture's place is like a note from her explaining that she's not going to share the picture with anybody, but she wants to keep it for her own protection. The last trope that I have for Sherlock, but it isn't really a mystery trope, it does come up a lot, I guess, would be the foil character, which is Watson. Watson is basically the opposite of Sherlock Holmes in every way. Where Sherlock is cold and detached and observant, Watson tends to miss a lot of things. However, in most interpretations, Watson is the very personable one, and Watson is the definitely more mentally healthy one and the more mature one of the two. And they have this very close friendship and kind of a bromance going on, which is very sweet. A lot of the times in the stories in particular, Watson spends most of the time just being like, "My God, Sherlock, you're amazing!" A lot of the short stories where he's just like, "My God, Sherlock Holmes, how did you do it?" And he's like, "Let me explain to you." But in a lot of the more modern interpretations, they try to build a lot more characterization between the two and their friendship. That's always nice. The pairing of the two is always very interesting. Just cute little best friends, always solving crimes together. Stories are usually told through Watson's perspective. That's all I've got for you today, folks, on these tropes that I am Sherlocked with. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any more tropes that you think I left out, or any Sherlock Holmes examples that you think I need to include, please put them in the comments below. I'm always looking for more things to read, and don't forget to subscribe, and of course, happy writing!